Welcome back to Feminism, Theory and Practice. In the last video, we laid the groundwork. We talked about what feminism actually is. Not the caricature you see on social media, but a serious intellectual tradition with three dimensions: analysis, critique, and movement. We explored the difference between sex and gender. We introduced the concept of patriarchy as a system, and we looked at the wave framework while also critiquing its limitations. Today, we are diving into the first wave. Now, I want to be upfront about something. The first wave is usually taught as a feel good story. Brave women fighting for the vote, finally getting it, the end, progress achieved. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete. Because the first wave was also a story of exclusions, of whose voices were heard and whose were silenced, of how race, class, and empire shaped which women got to speak for all women. So today's we are going to do both. Celebrate the achievements and confront the blind spots. That's what rigorous thinking looks like. Let's begin. Before we talk about first wave, we need to understand what it was fighting against. What was like for women in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe, in America, and India. Let's start with the legal reality. In England and America, there was a legal doctrine called coverture. Under coverture, when a woman married, her legal identity was literally absorbed into her husband's. She ceased to exist as a separate legal person. And what did this mean practically? A married woman could not own property. Anything she brought into the marriage, money, land, inheritance, became her husband's. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued. She had no legal custody for her own children. If she worked, her wages belonged to her husband. The great English jurist William Blackstone explained it this way: by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. The very being or legal existence of woman is suspended during the marriage. Suspended, as if women were in kind of a legal coma. And of course, women couldn't vote. Not in Britain, not in America, not in most of Europe. The people making laws about women's lives were exclusively men. The irony of this, men deciding what was best for women, seems almost too obvious to state. But for centuries, this was simply how things were. Beyond law, there were social expectations. Higher education was essentially closed to women. Universities like Oxford and Cambridge didn't grant degrees to women until the 20th century. In America, the first women's college emerged only in the mid 1800s, and they were controversial. The argument against educating women was always the same: their brains couldn't handle it. Education would make them unfeminine, it would damage their reproductive health, it would make them unsuitable for their true calling, motherhood, and domesticity. Public speaking was considered improper for women. When women did speak publicly, like the Grimmig sisters in 1830s America, who spoke against slavery, they were attacked, not just for what they said, but for the fact that they dared to speak at all. This was the world the first wave emerged from. A world where women were legally, educationally, economically, and socially subordinate, not by accident, but by design, encoded in law, justified by religion, by science, by tradition. And then some women started asking why. The story often begins with Mary Wollstonecraft and her book A Vindication of Rights of Women, published in 1792. Wollstonecraft was writing during the French Revolution, a moment when ideas about rights, liberty, and equality were in the air. Men were declaring the rights of man. And Wollstonecraft asked a simple, devastating question: what about women? Her argument was elegant. If you believe humans are rational beings who deserves education and freedom, then you have to include women. If women seem less rational than men, it's because they have been denied education and confined to the frivolous pursuit. Give women the same education, the same opportunities, and you will see the same capacities. This was radical. Wollstonecraft wasn't asking for charity or protection. She was demanding that women be treated as fully human, with the same rational potential as men. Of course, she was vilified for it. After her death, her husband published a memoir revealing her unconventional personal life, her affairs, her suicide attempts, her child born out of wedlock. For decades, her ideas were dismissed because of her biography. That's a pattern we'll see again and again. Women's argument being attacked through their characters rather than their logic. Fast forward to 1848. Seneca Falls, New York, a small town where about 300 people gathered for what would become the founding moment of American feminism. The organizers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, did something clever. They modeled their declaration of sentiments on the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self evident that all men and women are created equal. This declaration listed grievances against men, much as the original declaration listed grievances against the king. He has denied her the right to vote. He has taken from her all the right to property. He has denied her access to education and employment. He has made her, if married, civilly dead. But here's what's interesting. Even at Seneca Falls, women's suffrage, the right to vote, was controversial. Many attendees thought it was too radical of idea. It passed by a narrow margin. The idea that women might participate in politics was, even to reformers, a step too far. By the early 20th century, patience was wearing thin. In Britain, different kind of movement, Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, led a movement. They were done with polite petitions and peaceful marches. They called themselves suffragettes, a term originally used to mock them, which they reclaimed. And they took direct action, breaking windows, setting fires, disrupting parliament. When arrested, they went on hunger strikes and they were force fed, a brutal, painful procedure that amounted to torture. Were they right to use these tactics? That's a debate that continues today. What's undeniable is that they forced the issue. They made it impossible to ignore. The First World War changed everything. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, in factories, in hospitals, in every sector where men had been drafted. And after the war, it became very hard to argue that women who had kept society running were somehow incapable of casting a vote. Britain granted some women to vote in 1918. Full suffrage came in 1928. The US passed the 90th Amendment in 1920. Victory, right? Well, not so fast. Here's what triumphant narrative leaves out. When 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote in 1870s, many white suffragists were furious, not because they opposed racism, but because they felt betrayed. Why should black men vote before white women? Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the same woman who organized Seneca Falls, said things I'm not going to repeat in full. But she argued that educated white women deserve the vote more than ignorant black men and immigrants. She deployed racist, nativist arguments to make her case. And this wasn't just a rhetoric. When the suffrage movement reorganized in the late 19th century, it explicitly adopted a southern strategy, courting white southern women by assuring them that the women's suffrage wouldn't threaten white supremacy. Black women were excluded from major suffrage organizations. At suffrage parades, they were asked to march in the back or not at all. Ida B. Wells, the great black journalist and anti-lynching activist, was told to march at the back of 1913 suffrage parade in Washington. She refused. She stepped into the white section when it passed by. But her defiance didn't change the movement's fundamental character. And after the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, black women in the South still couldn't vote. Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, violence prevented them from exercising their legal rights for another 4 decades. The Voting Rights Act wasn't passed until 1965. So when we say women got the vote in 1920, we need to ask which women? Race wasn't the only fault line. Most first wave leaders were middle class or upper class women. Their concerns, access to education, property rights, entry into professions, reflected their class position. Working class women had different priorities: fair wages, safe working conditions, limit on the working hours. When middle class suffragists talked about women's right to work, they meant the right to become doctors and lawyers. Working class women had always worked in factories as domestic servants in sweated industries under brutal conditions. They didn't need permission to work. They needed protection from exploitation. And then there's empire. British suffragists were demanding rights as citizens of an empire that denied those same rights to millions of colonized people. Some were explicitly imperialists. They argued that giving British women the vote would strengthen the empire, that educated British women would be better administrators of colonial subjects. This is what intersectionality helps us to see. The first wave wasn't a unified movement of women. It was a movement led primarily by white middle class women in imperialist nations, whose vision of liberation was shaped by their particular position in hierarchies of race, class, and nation. Perhaps no one captured this condition better than Sojourner Truth, the formerly enslaved woman who became an abolitionist and women's right advocate at a women's right convention in 1951. She allegedly delivered a speech now known as "Ain't I a Woman?" When men argued that women were too delicate for politics, too weak for public life, Truth pointed out that she had plowed and planted and gathered into barns. She had borne 13 children and seen most of them sold into slavery. If the argument for women's exclusion was their fragility, what did that mean for black women who had never been treated as fragile? Her question exposed the lie. The woman in women's right was really a specific kind of woman: white, middle class, protected. Other women had always been treated as workers, as bodies, as property. The first woman wave's language of universal womanhood concealed very particular interests. Now, let's turn to India, because the story there looks very different from Western first wave. In 19th century India, debates about women's status became central to larger question about tradition, modernity, and national identity. The British called it the woman question, and they used it as a justification for colonial rule. Look how Indians treat their women, they said. Look at sati, at child marriage, at parda. This proves they need to be civilized. For Indian reformers, this created a dilemma. How do you advocate for women's right without appearing to agree with colonial propaganda? How do you critique patriarchal practices without seeming to betray your culture to foreign rulers? Different people answered this differently. Social reform movements like the Brahmo Samaj and Prarthana Samaj advocated for widow remarriage, women's education, and ending child marriage. Raja Ram Mohan Roy campaigned against sati. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar pushed for widow remarriage. These were important interventions. But notice who was doing the reforming. Mostly upper caste men. Women were objects of reform, not agents of change. The debate was between men about what should be done with women, and the reforms often reinforced caste hierarchy. When reformers advocated for women's education, they meant education for upper caste women that would make them better wives and mothers, not liberation in any radical sense. But women were not silent. In lecture 1, we introduced Savitri Bai Phule and Tarabai Shinde. Let me say more about them now. Savitri Bai Phule and her husband, Jyoti Rao, opened schools for girls and for Dalits in 1840s and 50s. This was decades before most respectable reform movements, and they faced violent opposition. People threw stones and dung at Savitri Bai as she walked to school. What made the Phules different was that they connected caste and gender. They understood that you couldn't talk about women's liberation without talking about Brahminical patriarchy. The way upper caste religious texts were used to justify both caste hierarchy and gender oppression. This was intersectional analysis decades before the term existed. Tarabai Shinde's 1882 text, Stri Purush Tulna, a comparison between women and men, is one of the most radical feminist texts in 19th century. It's furious, it's funny, it systematically demolishes every argument for male superiority. And it was written by a woman with no formal education in Marathi, in a small town in Maharashtra. But here's the tragedy. These voices were marginalized in their own time and already forgotten by mainstream Indian feminism for decades. When women's history was written, it centered upper caste reformers. The Dalit feminist tradition had to be recovered and recentered by, by scholars like Sharmila Reg in the late 20th century. By the late 19th century and early 20th century, the nationalist movement began incorporating women, but in a complicated ways. Women became symbols of the nation. Mother India, Bharat Mata, they were celebrated as embodiments of tradition, spirituality, and cultural purity. This elevated women symbolically while also limiting them to certain roles. The nationalist logic went something like this. Indian women are pure and spiritual, unlike Western women who are materialistic and overly liberated. By keeping our women in their traditional roles, we preserve what's valuable about our culture. Women's reform should make them educated enough to be good nationalist mothers, not so liberated that they become like Western women. This is what historian Partha Chatterjee called the nationalist resolution of the women's question. Women's equality was perpetually deferred, subordinate to the larger goal of national liberation. First independence, then women rights. Sounds familiar? It's a pattern we see again and again. Women being asked to wait to put their demands aside for larger cause. And the larger cause somehow never ends. So, where does this leaves us? The first wave achieved remarkable things. It challenged the legal fiction that women were not persons. It won access to education, to property, to the professions. In many countries, it won the vote. It made visible what has been invisible, the political subordination of half of the humanity. But it was also limited by the perspectives of those who led it. The first wave's vision of women was often really a vision of white middle class Western women. Its analysis of oppression rarely extends to race, class, caste, or colonialism. Its victories were partial and they were unevenly distributed. This isn't to dismiss the first wave, it's to understand it honestly. Every liberation movement carries the limitations of its historical movement. The task is not to judge the past by today's standard, but to learn from it, to see how even radical movements can reproduce hierarchies and to do better. Let me leave you now with three key points. First, the first wave fought against a world where a women were legally, educationally, and politically subordinate. Their central demand that women are citizens with rights was revolutionary in its time. Second, the first wave was shaped by race, class, and empire. Its leaders were mostly white middle class women whose vision didn't include all women equally. Figures like Sojourner Truth and Savitri Bai Phule challenged this, but their voices were often marginalized. Third, the Indian context shows how gender politics intersects with colonialism and nationalism. The women question became a site of struggle between colonial condensation and nationalist resistance, often leaving women's own voices out of the conversation. In the next video, we're going to explore one of the most famous phrases in the feminist history: the personal is political. The second wave took the first wave's focus on legal rights and asked, what about everything else? What about housework, childbearing, sexuality, domestic violence, everything else? What about housework? So that's where things get really interesting. If you found this valuable, subscribe and hit the bell. I want to build a community of people who think seriously about these ideas. Leave a comment telling me what struck you the most or what you want me to cover in more depth. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.